HR leaders know exactly what it feels like to be overwhelmed by project after project and dueling priorities and the fallout that happens as a result of all of that, with communication issues and upset teams and misaligned priorities and everything like that. So how do we get out of this cycle? That's what we're going to talk about today. In today's episode, we have Shalissa Bainbridge. With over 25 years of corporate leadership, Shalissa is a transformative executive coach, consultant, and CEO of Catapult Leadership Programs in Toronto, Canada. She champions creating enjoyable and fulfilling workplaces and views effective leadership as pivotal for inspiring positive change. In our conversation, we talk about ways to transform your organization through value-driven leadership, common mistakes that we make in doing this, and steps we can take to really break through. If you enjoyed today's conversation, make sure you like and subscribe and tune in for future episodes just like this. Thank you so much for joining today, Shalissa.
Thank you, Brittany, for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here with you. I'm very honored to have been invited to your podcast, and I look forward to this time with you.
I look forward to it as well. So today we're talking about value-driven leadership. I feel like that's a very loaded topic, and a lot of people don't really think about it. I think oftentimes when you think about value-driven leadership, you might automatically think of culture and even personal values. So kind of frame value-driven leadership, explain what it is, and then we'll dive into it.
Okay, it is loaded, so I'll do my best to make it a short sort of summary explanation. So when we talk about value-driven leadership, we're talking about helping leaders to rethink the work that they are doing and the work that their teams are doing so that it's driving value instead of volume. I guess that's the best way to say it, because what we've noticed working with large organizations, working with leaders, there is still this big systemic problem of so much work on the go, and everything feels equally urgent and equally important. And you only have a set number of individuals, and everyone is now spread very thinly across a large, range of work, versus helping leaders to understand the tremendous impact of bringing that, what in agile terms we call it WIP, but bringing that work in progress down to the few that will make maximum impact. And so now, instead of going broad and sort of thin across all of this work, you're going very deep into a few pieces of work or projects, initiatives, whatever, that will drive tremendous value for the business. It's a bit of a mindset shift for a lot of leaders, because a lot of leaders still feel like more is more. So this value-driven leadership is actually proof that less is more. You'll go much further.
I love the idea of that. And I know that in my program, the HR Leadership Library, I focus so much on optimizing what you do. But oftentimes we can't optimize our work if we're drowning in it. And so value-driven leadership allows us to make the space to optimize, make the space to really focus on what actually matters, what's going to bring you forward. And so I love the idea of value-driven leadership, because it helps you to break out of the mindset that I think a lot of us have. I know I had it when I first got into the industry as well, assuming that if we work hard enough, the work will one day get completed. I think in HR, we have to realize that the work is never done. There's always going to be more work to do. So value-driven leadership allows us to make that space to focus on what's most important and continue to move things forward. I absolutely love that.
Well, there's a second part to this whole value-driven leadership conversation that I have with leaders. And it's, again, another big mindset shift is, if you do the work upfront, now we would show them how to think through the work and land on the top 3-4 things, right? Depending on the size of the team and so on. But you really don't want 35 initiatives. You want, like, what are those top things that will drive the greatest value? Now, we would help them to figure out what that is. However, the second part to this is like a part B. If the team starts working on this thing, so let's say you've managed to get to the point where you're boiling it down to 3 to 5 key pieces or less, like less is more, remember? So it's like, if you're at 5, maybe you question the 5, can you bring it down even further? But let's say you land on the items that you feel are very impactful. Here's part B. Part B is, as your team starts to work on that thing, if they start to realize, you know what, I don't think it's actually going to bring the value that we feel it's going to bring, stop. or question, have the conversation, pause. So part B is really about just because you started it and you said on some document or report that you're going to be doing this for this fiscal year, it doesn't mean that you should continue to do it if there's indication that it's not going to deliver the value that you thought originally. So then
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to, why do that, right? So just because you said it. So we train leaders to think through that differently. So you have your initiatives, you have the work that you're doing, you start that work. It's almost still, even though you've decided that this is the work you're going to do, you should still think about it as a hypothesis, because until that team really starts to put, the rubber to the road sort of thing, they're not really going to understand or see that value kind of starting to materialize, right? And sometimes they don't, but they still push through because they said that that's what they would do for that year. So that second part is really about, if you don't see the value, have a conversation, decide what you want to do next. Likely it's you stop, or maybe you take that initiative and it's not the full thing that you do, but you see like components of it would be very valuable. And so you just focus on those components, or you stop altogether and you pull in another initiative that maybe, would add greater value. So there's a part A and a part B.
Yes, and I love that. It's almost like writing the plan in pencil instead of pen, and then building in some checkpoints along the way to continue to reassess whether the
Yeah.
plan is on the right path. Is that the right way of thinking of that?
Yeah, like are we, so we, there would be some work that would be done up front to assess, pick out those 3 initiatives or 4 initiatives, whatever, from the 30 ideas that you have. So there would be some work, but really and truly, until the team starts to actually dive in, they really, up until that point, it still should be considered a bit of an experiment. Like, we think that these things, this is our hypothesis. We believe that these things would add a lot of value. Sometimes, I'd say oftentimes, depending on the rigor that they put in up front, they realize, yep, we're right on track. And sometimes they're like, you know what, I think we might have misread this, or maybe there were too many assumptions that we baked into, deciding whether or not this was high value and purpose aligned and so on. So maybe we should switch. So the idea here is not to invest time and money into work that will not deliver the value. The minute you think, you start to question, is it really going to deliver this value? You make a decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's really what it's all about. And I find that when we're talking to leaders, the very first element that's missing that causes this bloat in work is a lack of purpose. So one of the first steps that we would do is ask the leader and the team, well, what is your purpose? This team was created for a specific reason. That's their why. What is that? What is that why? Do you even know? And the interesting thing, Bryttani, is the first time I ran that session and I asked that question, I honestly thought that it would have been a slam dunk. They would have said, oh, this is our why. This is why we're doing it. When I ran that session, I thought it would have been a 10-minute conversation. It was a 45-minute conversation
Yeah.
with the team, because they all had different articulations of their purpose and why they exist and what they're doing and what they're focusing on. And immediately you could see, okay, it makes sense that they have a bit of bloat now in their team, because they're all taking in different things. So the first step toward value-driven leadership is really, I would say, is really kind of honing in and aligning on what that purpose is. And then the rest kind of falls into place.
Great, great. So for you, you cover a lot of different things in your coaching and consulting business. How
Yeah.
did value-driven leadership become an area where you want to prioritize and help businesses and leaders to break through this pitfall that we make often?
Well, it starts with, let's say, maybe there's a leader who's reaching out to me for coaching on a specific topic, or it's a company that's reaching out because they want to do something differently. The minute we get into those conversations, we realize a lot of the time that what they'd like to achieve is great, but they don't have the time to actually invest in achieving that thing and doing that thing. Or they want to introduce some sort of newness into their team, new processes, new way of working, whatever. But again, the team is so overworked. And so no matter where we turn, we are encountering teams and leaders who want to do the right thing. But then when you start to dive into it, when are you going to do this? So this overwork, this overburdening that is happening like everywhere. I have yet to come across a team that's really figured out how to create a good sized workday that leaves room within that workday for their employees to think and process and problem solve and improve and optimize. That time is not there. Even learn, right? Like, so if we have teams who do not have time to learn, that's kind of a red flag for us. So it's again a bit of a mindset shift, because a lot of businesses and senior leaders and leaders, even teams themselves, feel like they have to be on working and grinding from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., right? Or, some version, they may or may not take a lunch. They're likely working through their lunch. So that if they can't solve for their time, we cannot really help them improve beyond where they are. So we like to take them back a step and say, okay, let's start to create a bit of space in your workday. And then we work through, that process. We create a bit of space. And this bleeds into conversations around meetings and who should be like, I'm constantly in meetings, morning, noon, and night. And, so it's a bigger conversation about productivity and where is your time being spent, both in meetings and on work, bringing that back a little bit so that they have a little bit of breathing room. And now we can start to talk about what are some of the improvements you want to make. So that's how this sort of all came out. It happened very, very organically. And then it became a pattern that no matter where we worked, they had the best of intentions, but how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it at 10 o'clock at night? Like
Right.
let's work on bringing some of that, on relieving some of your time so that you can focus on some of the improvements.
So for HR leaders, I know oftentimes we're in a lot of projects. Some of the projects we work on are our own. And
Yeah.
oftentimes we involve other people, other subject matter experts, other stakeholders, other senior leaders to help us with our projects. So when it comes to finding ways to make space in our time, what advice do you have for HR leaders to almost not necessarily create a culture, but to really empower the leaders to make space in their team's days for learning and optimization, things like that? What advice do you have for HR leaders to help continue to foster that kind of environment?
For the people that they're serving in the organization?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important, first of all, for HR to walk the walk and talk the talk. So if
Yes.
if HR is also inundated and doesn't really understand how to bring that workload down within that group, then they're really in no position to be able to, spearhead any of those conversations. So the first thing from an HR perspective is I would suggest experiment with some of the things that I'm talking about and really build that into your HR department first. Experiment, explore it, see how your team feels about the changes that are happening, and then get to a point where you are now confident enough to say, look, we've implemented this within HR. It's extremely powerful to us. We want to show you, and you can go through it, team. It doesn't have to be big bang, like pick a leader here, pick a leader there. It's a gentle kind of very unofficial sort of rollout. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have a big launch for this or anything, but just sort of start to coach your leaders to say, hey, this is what we've been doing. I really think that we should give it a shot with your team. And when you start to do that and sort of soft roll it out, pick teams that are more manageable. Don't pick the big ones that
Yeah.
may be suffering the most. Pick the smaller ones that are kind of easier to support. And then with every team that you support, you're learning more and more from your own personal experience, from the teams that you're supporting, and then you build up to sort of the bigger, more complex teams.
That's fantastic advice. It's almost the idea of you can't help somebody else if you're already drowning. So you've got to walk the walk first. You've got to do it first, and then use what you've learned to then support others in the business. I love that, and that's really been my experience as well when it comes to when I talk with my HR clients about ways to build their career, ways to make more money, ways to have more impact and more influence. You really can't do those things if you don't have the capacity to do it first. And you got to show
Right.
yourself to be capable of doing those things before you're able to be viewed to work on bigger projects and bigger initiatives and things like that.
Yeah, it's the capacity, and it's also you truly have to be bought in. So, and you truly have to feel like you're reaping the benefits of this new way of working. So, for starters, going back into your role, let's say on Monday, and really even asking yourself and asking your team, what is our purpose? What do we feel our purpose is? And having that conversation. That could be, again, a 45-minute conversation in and of itself. But if it's if it's not an immediate, and it won't be, if it's not an immediate, this is our purpose, and they're all kind of articulating it in the same way, I think that's the best place to start. Let's re-anchor on what our purpose is. And the purpose should be very, very simple. I've got some notes here. I'm just going to pull it up on my side. So this is the exercise, and it's a very simple exercise. You would, let's say, Bryttani, you're leading a team of 5 individuals, for example, right? And you ask your team, you're the leader, and you ask your team, what is our true purpose here? What is our why? Why did this company set this particular team up? So the first thing that you would do is really have a conversation across the whole team together around what is the work that you do? What do you do? The second thing is, who do you serve? And they're likely internals, right? In some cases, some of our teams have direct contact with the outside customer, client, whoever. In your case, it's probably a set of internal customers. And then you put those two things together and you articulate the value. The value and the work that you do are very different.
Right.
So as an example, I'll just talk about this for 2 seconds because I think it's a really important, this is something that it's an exercise that your followers could probably test out. But the value and the work that you do are going to be articulated differently, but when they start talking, it's going to start to sound the same. So as an example, if the work that you do for a home builder is that you lay bricks, the work that you do is everything around laying the actual brick and building those walls. The people you serve, you're working for the builder, but you're ultimately serving a family who will live in that home. Now, the value that you bring is not that you're an excellent bricklayer. We've already covered that in the stuff that you do. The value that you bring is that you're creating a strong, sturdy, safe structure within which a family can live and feel safe, and so on and so forth. That's the actual value. So that's the difference between the work you do, who you serve, and the value that you bring. And then you pull all those 3 things together. And there's a statement that I've come up with, which is, it's actually quite simple. It's, we support X by delivering Y so that Z, or resulting in Z. So we support, that's your customer, by delivering, that's the stuff that you do, resulting in Z, which is your value. And so this is a really fun exercise to do with teams, because you're actually giving them, list all your X's, list all your Y's, list all your Z's. You have really good conversations about your X and your Y, because you'll see that there are going to be some differences there. And if there are differences, it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing it with these X's. Maybe these are our core X's. Maybe this is our core Y. And then eventually you get to a nice clean statement, right? So that's ultimately the first step. And then you can use that as a purpose filter, what I call a purpose filter. So any work that comes your way, you can actually align it with that purpose statement. And that is the first step in questioning if whether or not what you're doing is worth you guys doing it. So it really starts to help weed out things that are not purpose driven. Then you are left with things that are, and then you start to question the value of those things. So over time, that's a very simple way of saying, we're up here. Now we're going to kind of funnel it down to the things that are purpose driven and value added. So that's what I would recommend as a first step for anyone who wants to kind of try this out.
I love that. And for me, as you were talking about the value statement, or the I help this person to do this so that this can happen, it reminds me of, as business owners, we do the same thing as for our clients that we serve. We have to create that same value statement for ourselves so that we know what is our purpose, what are we doing. And it reminds me, and I know this is diving into another conversation that maybe we can talk about another time, but it reminds me of the push recently for companies to have not necessarily entrepreneurs in their businesses, but entrepreneurs, where in individual business units, the business leaders of those units are owning their area in a way that helps them to run it as if it was their business, run it as if it was their baby, so to speak. And so I love that. It's almost like value-driven leadership is almost a precursor to entrepreneurship. I just had that light bulb moment as
I love that. Talking. I'm going to have to write that down.
When you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting to think of it that way.
Well, you're 100% right, because one of the things that we talk about when we're having these conversations with teams is, you can't treat, no matter how large the organization is, no matter how much money they're generating, it's never don't just treat it as a bottomless pit of money. We
Right.
can actually do all of this stuff. We can hire more people. That entrepreneurial mindset is
Mm-hmm.
actually, I didn't make an explicit connection the way that you just did, but it is actually something that happens very organically in our
Yeah.
conversations because you do want to maximize your resources, whether they're
Mm-hmm.
people, the funds, and this will get into a whole other conversation,
Yeah.
really. But even when we're funding things, and we've had conversations about how you fund initiatives with some of the biggest banks here in Canada, where instead of saying, okay, we're going to try this initiative for whatever, millions of dollars, allocate like a couple 100,000 to even assess whether or not that thing is making sense. And then if it does make sense and it kind of passes that next level, then you can allocate whatever else you need to allocate to get to that next level of assessment and so on. So you're kind of building instead of throwing all this money in a thing that really hasn't been discovered appropriately,
Mm-hmm.
or understood deeply enough. And now you've signed off on it. And now your team, whether it's good or not, is going to kind of work through it to the end of the year. Let's just take baby steps. But that again, that's a very difficult change to make sometimes within an organization. You're talking about financial, allocation of funds. So, but that is something that we try to do, and it's a very kind of a startup-y, model, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we do try to get leaders and teams to think about that. Like, if this was your money,
Yes.
would you spend your money on this? I know for myself as an entrepreneur, my husband and I are in business together. We both work together on our school and so on. We question everything down to the penny, and it's important to do that. If an app costs $20 a month, but we're not using it, we kill it. Like and so helping them to adopt that mindset is also very, very important because it's not just about, we could talk about mental health. It's not just about mental health and pushing people to that breaking point where they're working constantly and they're trying to live a decent life with their families and so on, and pushing them beyond that point. That's a huge risk, but there's also a bigger risk around what is that actual, are you actually achieving anything by pushing everyone so hard? Are you
Right.
actually getting the results that you wanted to get out of these initiatives? So yeah, I love the connection that you made there, Bryttani. And those conversations do happen very organically.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me because when I've talked to my clientele, my clients are likely more often HR departments of one because that's where I primarily serve that segment of the HR population. And in our work, we do feel like we're working in startups because even if there was someone who was doing the HR role prior to us or them,
Yeah,
from the feedback that I received, the person in the role prior, didn't look at HR the way this person is looking at HR. They were
right,
doing more the administrative work, the operational work, not necessarily working to be more strategic. And even 10
right.
years ago, the conversations were about, how does HR get a seat at the table? And today we have that seat at the table. Now it's about making the most of that space. So
That's right.
everything we've talked about today is really going to help these HR leaders to either adopt this mindset of value driven leadership and entrepreneurship, or to reaffirm that they're on the right path of thinking these things through and that it's not going wasted. So this has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad it's been very helpful. Yeah. So again, starting, I guess, internally is a really great place to experiment, even within a small team, and then kind of expanding out from there.
Fantastic. So as we close our time, are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave these leaders with, whether they're, in an HR role right now, leading a department of 2 or 5, or any closing thoughts?
I think for HR leaders, I think it could be just so valuable to really help your team think in terms of, why are we really doing this? Is this really adding value? And at first, it could feel like you're thinking too differently. You're almost thinking differently than what the culture would, require you, the way that the culture would require you to think.
Mm-hmm.
But this is actually we have a trademark, and it's go off script. We tell leaders to go off script, to challenge themselves to go off script. And as much as it may feel contrary maybe to the culture that they're in overall in the company, at the end of the day, those leaders who do manage to go off script and experiment and think differently, are the ones that stand out.
That's
And
exactly right.
yeah, they bring newness, right? It can feel a little uncomfortable. It can feel like you're not really part of the family for a minute. Everyone is eating one thing and you're eating something else, or you're trying out other food or whatever the case is. But I would strongly suggest that HR leaders experiment in safe ways within their own area and encourage their teams to also experiment and see what works, and then expose that and share that knowledge.
That's great. Thank you so much for all of this, Shalissa. If anyone wants to find you to, dig into any of this more deeply or to work with you further, where could they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Shalissa Bainbridge, and they could also connect with me through my company website, which is catapultprograms.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do, Shalissa, and for your time here today. It's been so, so valuable, and I'm so appreciative. So thank you
Thank you
so
again.
much.
Thank you for having me.
That ends our episode of HR Leadership Lessons. Everything we discussed today can be found at talentedteamsconsulting.com. Head to our website to access the show notes, relevant links, and all the resources you need to grow on purpose in HR leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and be sure to never miss future content. Drop us a review and show us some love, and show our guests some love on social media. Thanks again for listening.